Hello and welcome to everyone who is joining us in this virtual space and environment. My name is Paris Wicker. I'm a project assistant in University Health Services here at UW-Madison, and I'm also a PhD student in the School of Education. And I am here along with my colleague Rionda, and she'll introduce herself in a second, to give a presentation around sense of belonging. And the title of our session is Who Belongs, Who Matters? Connecting Racism and Health Equity to Sense of Belonging at UW-Madison. So Rionda, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. I am Rionda Washington, and I work as a substance abuse specialist, prevention specialist at University Health Services, as well as an inclusion education assessment specialist in the Office of Inclusion Education. And we will be presenting some interesting findings to you. I'll turn it back over to Paris.
Yeah, thanks, Rionda. And so we have a few objectives for this presentation, this session today. And a part of it is learning about sense of belonging, what it is. Likely you're coming to this session because maybe you have heard of the phrase sense of belonging. It is sort of a popular buzzword right now within higher education. And so part of this is learning what is sense of belonging and why is it important on a college campus and how campus climate specifically shapes it. We're going to learn a little bit about the research around sense of belonging and how it impacts health and well-being. And then we're going to situate a sense of belonging specifically within UW and put it within the context of this campus and what it means. We'll definitely have some opportunities to reflect on our own experiences. I think an important part of this work is to not think of sense of belonging as something outside of ourselves. The reason why it's so interesting on a college campus is because it's collectively constructed, which means that we all play a role in sense of belonging, not only for ourselves, but also for other people on this campus. And then we're also going to tie sense of belonging back to issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And so by the end of our, 60, 75 minutes together, you'll have an opportunity to understand why sense of belonging is important and what your role is in fostering that on this campus. We have a little bit of a roadmap for this session today. So we'll start with the belonging exercise. That will sort of get us in the framework and the narrative of why it's important. We'll spend some time talking about what sense of belonging is and what it is not. We'll learn a little bit about research, and then we'll situate it at UW with some really compelling research that Rionda is going to share with us from years of data collection around sense of belonging. Then we'll talk about why it matters, why we care about it, why it's an equity and health issue, especially related to prevention, which is the unit that we work in University Health Services. And then there'll be some time for reflection and a call to action. Now, if we were in person, we would be doing these things together and then collectively talking and having a discussion. But I encourage you to still do these exercises with yourself, write them down, share them with your colleagues. I'm sure it's something that you would benefit from. So we are going to start again with a belonging exercise. And so Terrell Strayhorn is one of the leading scholars in sense of belonging research, especially on a college campus. And in his most recent book, he starts off with a really great exercise that he encourages everyone to do as they think about sense of belonging and what it means. So I'm going to read verbatim this exercise, and I encourage you, wherever you are in the virtual digital space, to take a moment to follow the prompt, to listen to what I'm reading, and to actually do the things that I'm asking you to do. And take a moment to write down and reflect on what emotions come up, what thoughts come up as you are doing this exercise, as you say these things to yourself. Is it something that you believe or don't believe? And think about, how your body feels as you go through this exercise. And again, this is from Strayhorn's book on belonging. Say this, I belong here. Now turn to someone near you and say it again. I belong here. If you're alone, grab your cell phone and text someone. I belong here. What's their reaction? What's yours? If you receive affirming nods in agreement or feel a sense of warmth, then pause and connect with the moment. That's your mind, cognitive, body, behavioral, and soul affective converging on the sentiment that you are important, that you matter to others around you, and you belong. If your declaration is met with blank stares, disagreement, dismissive laughter, or the all too familiar reply, question mark, exclamation, then take a moment to sense your feelings. Channel towards your mind. What are you thinking? What do you want to do now? What meaning do you make of the entire exchange? I think this is such a great exercise and a perfect way to start this presentation, as it's a reminder that for all of us, a sense of belonging is important. And for all of us, we have our own ideas and processes around whether or not we have a sense of belonging to the place that we're in and to the people that we're around. And definitely take note if your experiences were, yes, of course I belong, and that you received affirming thoughts or reactions from those around you. But if you did not, that is also something to note and to frame around why that may or may not be. So thank you all. In the chat for this recording, there will be an opportunity to leave thoughts and reflections and ideas. Definitely encourage you to use the chat feature and to put in anything that resonated with you through this exercise. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what is a sense of belonging. So we like to use Strahan's, there's many definitions out there. We like to use Strahan's definition because it was specifically created and framed around a college campus context. And it includes all the different components that may be a part of sense of belonging. And so it's perceived social support on campus, a sensation of feeling connected, an experience of mattering or feeling cared about, accepted or respected, feeling valued and important by the campus and others such as faculty, staff, and peers. And so I think the important thing, a part of this definition is that, yes, it is a perception, it is a thought pattern that students have, but these perceptions are shaped by people around them. It's not something that they just come up with individually. They come to this conclusion after interacting with other folks on campus, such as faculty, staff, and peers. And so it really is a collectively constructed sense of belonging. I just want to make a point of clarity. As I mentioned before, there are lots of different ways that you can measure belonging. And so you'll see lots of definitions. There are more sort of psychological need to belong or belongingness. And that's really focused on more psychological traits that some people, that there may be variation that people have in the need to belong, which is very different than whether or not they do or how they get to the point. So I just want to let you know that you may hear need to belong, belongingness, academic belonging, belonging within a particular major. And so we're really focusing on sense of belonging, which is a more collective approach we take in terms of belonging and how students think about whether or not they fit into a particular context. And I would also say that, especially on a college campus, lots of students coming in, especially during the transition, first-year students may feel like they're isolated or trying to find their way. And it's more of sort of a transient, maybe a short-term transition into campus. We know that that's a normal part of the transition process. But really what we're talking about for some students who are denied the ability to have a sense of belonging, that it really becomes more of a persistent state of stress, becomes more of a chronic condition, and that has all sorts of implications for their college experience and their college health. So again, we're focusing on sense of belonging, but no, there's lots of other types of belonging that are out there. So now we're going to delve a little bit into some of the research. There's been decades of research around sense of belonging. We're just going to highlight some of the, we think, some important things to keep in mind around what it is, and then we'll situate it within UW. So belonging, they have established a few decades ago that a sense of belonging, wanting to fit in, to feel valued, is really a human need and a right. It's a human need. If you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you've seen that the triangle, where at the bottom it's more sort of basic needs and food and shelter and clothing, and then you move up into sort of feeling loved and valued and connected. And at the very top of that triangle, you have sort of self-actualization and people fulfilling their purpose. And scholars have really placed the feeling and sense of belonging right along in that hierarchy of need. And so students aren't always necessarily able to produce higher level thinking and purpose and all the things that we want out of a college campus if they don't have that sense of belonging. Right up there is if they don't have enough food to eat or if they don't have shelter. And so scholars are calling for folks to really reframe how we think about sense of belonging instead of it just like individual thing that people have a choice over and that maybe they don't or need it. But no, really, it's a part of our human need and right. It's a cognitive process, which means it's something that happens in the brain that we think about, but more importantly on a college campus, and something that we're really interested in prevention, is that it shapes behaviors. It shapes feelings. And this is something that's really important because we try to create a campus in which students are choosing to do things that are going to be beneficial for their health, beneficial for their learning and their campus experiences. And what we see from the research is that when students don't have that sense of belonging, that they actually engage in behaviors that go against their best interest. Belonging is relational and it's reciprocal. As I said, it's about perceiving how you fit in with a particular group or community, that you're beneficial, that if you were to leave that certain campus or community, that something would be wrong. Things would not be the same. And so that's part of the process that's happening as students are trying to figure out, is this the place for me? Do I belong? What belonging is not is it's more than simply fitting in. And so some of the earlier ideas around college transition really encourage students to just assimilate to the dominant culture. Like once you get there, just do what everybody else is doing, and then you'll feel okay. And we know that it's more than that, and we know that there are students who will assimilate and still won't necessarily have that sense of belonging. So it's not necessarily about just doing what everybody else is doing. As I mentioned before, it's not individually constructed. It's about taking note and getting cues from your community around, are you feeling valued? Do you see yourself reflected in the community? And it's not necessarily solved by just adding more programs. And so the approach that we take is more of a policy systems and environmental approach. And in that way, programs are important, but we really need to think about the policy and the campus and just the larger structure of the environment that we're in. One of the books that have come out recently that I mentioned is just great if you have time and want to really delve into some research around belonging. It's called The Cost of Inclusion by Blake Silver. It came out last year, in which he did a big study looking at students and their path to belongingness and inclusion on a certain campus. And what he found was basically that for some students, particularly minoritized students, first-generation students to be a part of this social landscape, they worked really, really hard. It really affected their behaviors. And unfortunately, some of these students gave up opportunities for self-fulfillment. So we talked about that hierarchy of needs and sort of this self-actualization and reaching your higher purpose. Some students sacrificed that, gave up opportunities to do that so that they would have a sense of belonging. Students sacrificed their personal integrity. They limited themselves to stereotypes, particularly students of color. And I think the most devastating thing of this research is that even when they did those things, some of the students still didn't achieve their sense of belonging that they were looking for. And so I think this is a great study to look at sort of real world, how the need and the sense of belonging shapes what students do. And, you know, some students will behave against their own interest, even to achieve a sense of belonging, which is why it's so important. Just some other ideas around sense of belonging and how it drives student behavior. We see from research that identity, interpersonal interactions, and then institution, the type of institution matters. There's been some research that has shown that two-year colleges for students of color and for first-generation students, two-year colleges, those students seem to have a higher sense of belonging at those institutions rather than four-year. And it's sort of the reverse for other students. Four-year colleges seem to foster a better sense of belonging for everyone else except students of color and first-generation students. We know interpersonal, so who their students are talking to, how their perspectives are being valued both inside and outside of the classroom matters. And it's a perception that the institution cares about them. And perception matters because perception shapes behaviors and becomes a part of the reality of students' experiences. So positive interactions and perceived support are really important, as well as the institution. The lack of belonging, there's just so much research that, you know, the lack of belonging, it undermines academic performance. We've seen it's related to students being more likely to leave an institution. There's been some research that students who are more likely to transfer often feel like that they have to change large parts of themselves in order to fit into a certain college. And so that is usually one of the reasons why they feel compelled to leave the institution. And then having a sense of belonging, it's a really strong predictor of lots of other outcomes. So psychological, physical outcomes, thriving, happiness, well-being, higher GPAs, retention. The list really goes on and on. So we know, while it's not causation, we're not saying that sense of belonging causes those things, they definitely go hand in hand with a lot of great things that we want for our students at different institutions. And as I mentioned before, some students, because it's a human need, and in order to gain that sense of belonging, some students will sacrifice personal integrity, and that's something that we don't want. So now that we know what the belonging research is, we are going to situate that within a UW context, and Rihanna's going to help with that.
I'm going to be sharing some data from a couple of places that talk about sense of belonging and so what it looks like within our student populations. Some of the data I will be sharing will be from the Healthy Minds survey, which we've done in 2019 and 2016, the Color of Drinking survey, which was done in 2018, the Our Wisconsin surveys from 2020 and the one from the spring, and then Alcohol EDU from 2020 as well. What I want you to think about when I'm sharing some of this data is sort of the questions that the title sort of proposes is who matters, who belongs, who doesn't, and whose responsibility is it to foster a sense of belonging here at UW? But also, what information surprises you and what information rings true? So the chart that sort of started all, or that we like to build up from, is from Healthy Minds. And we took two components of belonging with two questions of one, I see myself as part of the campus community, which is the horizontal axis. And then I have a group, community, or social circle where I feel at UW-Madison, where I feel I belong, feel at home, known, connected to, and supported in my identity on the horizontal axis. And so there are different colors of dots to represent different student groups. And so I'm going to go through those for you. Race and ethnicity is green. Sexual orientation is yellow. Gender identity is red. First generation status is blue. Financial stress is pink. Registered disability is orange. Transfer student status is black. And nationality is purple. So what I want you to do is take a second and look at all of this. What is surprising to you based on your knowledge or experience on campus, and what isn't surprising? Sort of the main takeaways here are that students in the lower quadrant hold at least one marginalized identity, while students in the upper quadrant who have high sense of belonging hold non-marginalized identities. What does that bring up for you? And the link on the bottom of this slide, and we'll put it into the chat on the day of, is a link to a virtual version of this. And this is looking at all students. And on the virtual version, you can play with graduate, undergraduate by themselves, or with some of the different identities to see where they move. But because students are more than one thing, one of the things we look at is how marginalized identities stack. The more marginalized identities a student holds, the lower their sense of belonging. For those of you that are wondering for gender, what is the dominant identity? The dominant identity is male. But if students hold 2 or more marginalized identities out of the 8 that we had listed on the previous slide, sense of belonging is lower in their time that they are here on campus. So when we look specifically at first years, and this is from our Wisconsin last fall of 2020, because our Wisconsin started a little bit later than it did this year, and it was August 24th through November 19th collecting data. What we sort of see is that even within our first year undergraduate degree-seeking students, that for marginalized groups of them, belonging starts to become lower for them. And we asked this on our Wisconsin the same way it is asked in the climate survey from 2016. I feel like I belong. And we also looked at other first-year data that same year, because in Alcoholic EU I had the chart that year. Students' sense of belonging from their home institutions was relatively normal before they came into our environment. So it sort of looks at, when we think at first undergraduate students, firstly, we start seeing an erosion of sense of belonging once they're in our environmental bubble. When we look at discrimination as one of those factors that starts impacting sense of belonging, what we know from Healthy Minds, looking at all students, not just first years, 44% of students reported experiencing discrimination in the past year. The full question was, in the past 12 months, were you treated unfairly because of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or cultural background? Students who faced significant stigma or whom negative stereotypes strongly existed reported more discrimination in the past 12 months. This graph, and there are a couple more like it coming up, is sorted by range, largest range at the top, to which shows larger disparities in response by race, ethnicity, gender, or financial stress. Furthermore, for students who held more marginalized identities, the higher reports of discrimination. So from 20% of students with no marginalized identities to 75% in the past year, 12 months, for 4 or more marginalized identities having experienced discrimination. Again, when we go back and look at our first year students from our Wisconsin last year, within the first semester of being here, students reported seeing sexism, racism, and discrimination based on sexual orientation or homophobia on our campus at higher rates than students who took the same course on other campuses. So again, that progress of when students start experiencing things on our campus. So transitioning to another form of discrimination, specifically microaggressions. This is from Color of Drinking, and we did ask about microaggressions on that survey. 62% of students, undergraduate students of color, reported experiencing a microaggression on our campus. And a microaggression, as we defined it in Color Drinking, was brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. And in Color Drinking, we categorized students' responses because we asked about all microaggressions that they had experienced. And the category that had the second highest, most reported, were students talking about classroom interactions. And here are some of what they said they experienced in the classroom. And so why this is important to sense of belonging. Sense of belonging is not just co-curricular experience. It's also experience in the classroom, how students interact with peers and professors and teachers and faculty all play a part in how they feel sense of belonging to our campus. And going back to the factor that Paris talked about at the beginning, a tie to perceived support from peers, teachers, and family. So some of what students were said. I sometimes find in my classrooms that people often choose to ignore me or turn to a different person when given time to discuss certain topics. I have to go out of my way to talk to others, but even then I can sense some individuals do not feel comfortable talking to me. Or people, faculty at the university seem to think I am not capable of succeeding like my white peers. I never really have a sense of fitting in. Or being underestimated in the classroom. So thinking about how even these experiences shared here sort of compound for students and their sense of belonging if they're feeling like they don't fit in the classroom or that people treat them differently because of the marginalized identity they hold, how that plays into their sense. And as parents was also talking about, students try to give up pieces of themselves to change, to fit the norm, to fit what might be commonplace in the classroom. So we have some of that happening on our campus. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about mental health. And so we're again looking at healthy minds. And again, I know this was pre-pandemic and we know these numbers are higher currently now in our times. But what we saw is that for especially depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, disparities were higher for students who had marginalized identities by gender, sexual orientation, financial stress, in some cases race, ethnicity, international students, and first-generation students, as well as our transfer students. But we are seeing that mental health was higher for these groups. And for those of you that want to go into all the details about what groups and what question, please visit the Healthy Academic Toolkit, which is linked in our reference section, resources section, so that you can dig further by group. But the one I want to talk the most about is flourishing, because as Paris said early on, that thriving, happiness, well-being, and optimal functioning were satisfaction for sense of belonging, as well as positive psychological and physical outcomes. So when we look at flourishing, flourishing is defined as positive well-being, and it assesses students' well-being and perceived success in such areas as purpose, relationships, self-esteem, and positive attitude. A lot of our scales use the Diner Flourishing scores to measure positive well-being. And the Diner Flourishing scale asks questions like, I lead a purposeful life. My social relationships are supportive. I am interested in my daily activities. I actively contribute to the well-being of others. I am competent in the activities that are important to me. I have a good life. I am optimistic about my future, and people respect me. All things that, again, have nothing to do necessarily with being a college student or, measuring other things of success and well-being. But what we see on our campus is that flourishing, is definitely, flourishing is significantly less likely for students with marginalized identities. And so what we're seeing here is that if you have a marginalized identity, your flourishing is lower. The average flourishing is 40% for all students. And so you can see of the 9 identities that we have talked about, students have lower flourishing compared to their peers with the dominant identities. And even from 2016 to 2019, we saw a decrease by 7% in flourishing of our students. The students who are flourishing have the dominant identities, and so those students have higher senses of belonging. Now, one of the outliers for belonging ends up being alcohol. And so taking the Healthy Minds data again, we took all of the alcohol measures and sort of mapped sense of belonging by the two outliers. And so the audit, which is the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, and it measures alcohol use, and it's a clinical tool. We actually use it in the clinic here at UW, at UHS, to measure alcohol use among students. But sort of what you see with this chart is that any alcohol use, students have high sense of belonging, but the high audit scores, the binge drinking and alcohol impairing daily life, those students have the highest. So the more intense usage of alcohol have higher sense of belonging versus students who do not use or who did not binge, where alcohol have a low audit C score, alcohol has not impaired their daily life, have low sense of belonging. And we know from multiple studies that students with marginalized identities do not use alcohol as much as students with dominant identities through multiple data sources. And so going back to, again, Paris's point from earlier on, to gain a sense of belonging, some students sacrifice their personal integrity for a sense of belonging, or others feel they have to change who they are in order to fit in. Alcohol on this campus becomes one of those factors. The choice to drink or not to drink, which we could argue is a choice or not, impacts students' belonging and sets them on a path of outcomes. So when we look at our first year students from last year, even during the pandemic and last fall, Alcohol Part 1 was done before students came to campus, and Alcohol EDU Part 2 was done September 15th through November 16th, collecting data that fall semester. What we see, the light dots, are before students came to campus. So before students came into our environment, even during the pandemic, alcohol and belonging were not correlated. But then once students were in our environment for a couple of months and a couple of weeks, that line starts to form where alcohol use and belonging are becoming sort of in that line that we see with the Healthy Minds data for all students. So to also give you some information about what the different drinker types are in groups, abstainer is a student who consumed no alcohol in the past year. Non-drinker is a student who consumed no alcohol in the past 2 weeks, but may have consumed in the past year. A moderate drinker is a student who on the day of highest alcohol use in the past 2 weeks had 1 to 4 drinks if they were male or 1 to 3 drinks if female. Heavy episodic drinker on the day of highest drinker uses alcohol in the past 2 weeks, and the student had 5 to 9 drinks if they were male or 4 to 7 drinks if they were female. And a problematic drinker on highest day of use in the past 2 weeks, the student had 10 plus drinks if they were male or 8 plus drinks if they were female. So sort of going back to, and this is based on binary gender because BAC has not changed or evolved yet, you start seeing those heavy episodic and problematic drinkers, which make up what is considered high-risk drinkers, binge as if they've drinking it in 2 hours, tend to have the highest sense of belonging even among our first-year students compared to the students who don't drink or the abstainers. And it sort of follows that trend that we see in Healthy Minds when we look at all students. So switching gears to activities and involvement. And what we see here is the students who are more involved have higher sense of belonging, with a couple of outliers, being students who are not involved, being students involved in cultural or racial organizations, visual or fine arts organizations, gender or sexuality organizations have the lower sense of belonging. And we do know that the more involved students are, the higher their sense of belonging is, with the exception of some of those outliers. And so going back to some of the factors that Paris was talking about, identity and interpersonal and institutional variables help with sense of belonging or factors. Positive interpersonal period interaction is something that students get from being involved in student organizations or in student activities. However, also noting what belonging is not, it's not solved by adding more programs. So for those students who are involved in cultural organizations, even if they're involved in multiple, they don't get the same increased sense of belonging. I know this slide is like a lot of words. But what we see is that Black students have lower sense of belonging compared to other groups. And even if they are involved in a lot of things, their sense of belonging still remains low. The average sense of belonging was 74% for all students. But Black students, even involved in cultural orgs, only got 62%. If they were involved in no student organizations, they were at 52%. And even being involved in as many as 2 or more got them up to 65%, with being involved in academic student organizations, having them giving the most boost to sense of belonging, but still holding them at that 65%. For the organizations that have the biggest benefit to sense of belonging, fraternity or sorority life or athletics, Black students weren't as involved in those. And so what we're seeing is that race, in some cases, has a bigger impact in our campus environment to sense of belonging, specifically for Black students. So to think about our incoming students again, in our Wisconsin, there is a qualitative question where it asks students, what do you expect from diversity, equity, and inclusion at UW-Madison? And this year, the responses were a little bit different than last year. So yes, this past fall, August 2nd is when our Wisconsin opened, and it closed on August 26th. So our new incoming class, a lot of things they talked about was expecting sense of belonging, to find a place where I belong, to feel like I belong and be proud of who I am without fearing racism or putting myself in danger. That all people are not only welcomed, but that they will feel welcome and comfortable to express who they truly are. What we're seeing is that our incoming students are expecting belonging to be part of their experience. They are hopeful. They want to find belonging on our campus or have our campus help find belonging for them. And so they're putting that as a value when they're coming in. And in Strahan's other article that is in the resources, he talks to students who are looking for a sense of belonging or a place that they feel that they belong and are connected to as part of what the new class is looking for their generation of hope. And they want to be able to find that on the campuses that they choose. So this is something even our current incoming class was looking for. I wonder where they are on their journey. Have they found it? Have they experienced some of the other things? Watch the space. So to conclude some of the data at UW-Madison, within a student's first semester of our undergraduate population, belonging starts to erode for our marginalized students. Race and ethnicity has a greater weight on impacts, but students who hold other marginalized identities, sense of belonging is also impacted. Marginalized students groups who report lower rates of belonging have higher rates of mental health, higher rates of victimization, higher rates of experiencing discrimination, and low rates of alcohol use. I'm going to turn it back over to Paris.
Thank you, Rianda, for that research, and thank you for all that you do to bring this data to light. Every time that I see this information, I have really strong reactions. And so those of you who are maybe seeing this for the first time or seeing it again, I invite you to check in with yourself to see, because what Rianda is sharing, it's really compelling and in some ways pretty devastating data that we have here on our campus. And so I welcome you to thoughts and reflections in the chat, but also just to take note of like, does this make sense to you? If when you look at this data, you say, oh yeah, like I understand that. I've been there. Or are you really surprised and you've never experienced this before? Why belonging matters as an equity and health issue, certainly from an equity perspective, Rianda has shared the pretty consistent data that, belonging matters because through it, we can see inequities on our campus. We can see the invisible ways, right? Because oftentimes you can't always tell, it's not always something that you can see. So sometimes these invisible equities are really difficult to get at. But yet, looking through the lens of sense of belonging allows us to make visible sometimes these invisible experiences that are really harming our students. And the fact that our students who are already marginalized, who are already minoritized, who are already our most vulnerable constituents are also more likely to be harmed on this campus because of certain cultures, because of the prevalence of the high-risk drinking culture. I often feel devastated. I hope those of you that are watching feel equally compelled to want to do something differently. So sense of belonging matters as an equity issue because inequity exists. And as long as inequity exists, there is work to be done on this campus. And it matters as a health issue because it shapes behavior. And those of us that are interested in prevention and interested in health, we work very hard to try to influence folks' behavior so that they do things that go along with their best interests, with their health. And we see that sense of belonging can be sort of a protective factor for students to help them to survive and help them to thrive. So it matters because it's a resource. It's a resource that we can use to create a more equitable campus. And then also as a measurement, it's a really consistent predictor of a lot of things. So from a research standpoint, why not? It's a very useful, validated data point that you can use with the work that you're trying to do to create more equity on this campus. So it predicts a number of health-related outcomes related to mental health, depression and anxiety, and again, it shapes behavior. And also, in terms of inequity, for some students, they come on the campus and their sense of belonging may start to erode, but we have to think about some students who maybe came with a lower sense to begin with. Perhaps they are moving from a K through 12 institution where they also had that low sense of belonging, and now as they're just following that trajectory. For some students, this is a chronic condition. That education and low sense of belonging have gone hand in hand. And we do know that chronic forms of racialized stress, chronic forms of racism and discrimination, as Rhonda said, it erodes sense of belonging, it erodes health, it leads to a poor quality of life. And so this is why it matters, because it's so important for all the things that we hope and desire and want to instill on our campus and for our students. And it's not abstract. And so I hope that you are getting at the sense of urgency that I think is there to want to do something on this campus to make it better beyond individual. Like, yes, as we've seen, there are some things that individual students can do in order to help gain a sense of belonging. But that's not it. They alone cannot solve this problem. And so that's why we're here. We're hoping that that's why you are here to sort of figure out how do we move forward with this. Because if we are able to foster a sense of belonging, a lot of things that we desire, all the outcomes that we look for in terms of retention and graduation rates and all those things, sense of belonging is a part of that process. So now we sort of think about and look at creating change at UW-Madison. And this is always the difficult part of of the presentation, because, in some ways, the problem can seem so big and so vast, especially knowing that the culture of drinking, the culture of high-risk drinking is so problematic, right? That students who engage in it actually have a higher sense of belonging, right? The behaviors that we don't want, they seem to be thriving. And those who are doing the behaviors that we do want aren't getting sense of belonging, right? It seems massive in that way. And so, some of the ways in prevention, so we'll talk now about some of the ways in prevention that we try to think about change, but then also what does that mean for you in your work, right? Whether you're an administrator, staff, faculty, students, how do we move forward with knowing this information? Because like you, when I see the data, first I get sad, then I get mad, and then I'm like, okay, what can we do? And so part of our commitment in prevention is really collecting and tracking sense of belonging as a data point. We have lots of surveys and things of that nature, and there may be ways in which you are doing assessment and evaluation in your various units. And part of it is like, are you collecting that information? Mm-hmm. There are several sort of validated survey questions that you can use. Oftentimes it's, there's only a few questions that you can use to sort of figure out, like, how are students feeling around sense of belonging, the students that you particularly work with. Another thing that we remain committed to, and the reason why we can see inequity, is because we disaggregate data. And that may sound really simple, but that is not always done. Oftentimes, all students are sort of, or maybe all students of color kind of lumped together. And in some ways that is helpful, but sometimes you also need to break it down and disaggregate. Sometimes, all student identities are lumped together. But when you start to pull apart, if your data allows, like we have very large data sets and sometimes are larger sample sizes where we could do that, not always. But even in the data that you have, are you looking by identity? As Rihanna has shared, students with marginalized identities, particularly Black students on campus, are you looking by race, by ethnicity, by gender, by socioeconomic status? These are ways in which you can start to pull apart the story that is happening on campus. And as long as you don't do that, it's going to be very easy to not see this as a problem. So starting collecting the data, and then also disaggregating and looking by identity and multiple identity, multiple identities, and how that plays a role in sense of belonging. Certainly, as we have shared, the high-risk drinking culture on campus is problematic for lots of reasons, but how it erodes away sense of belonging and how it really shapes, in particular, BIPOC students, Black, Indigenous students of color. That is something that we really need to look at and think about, and really focusing on ways that we can interrupt that culture, because it is devastating in multiple fronts. And we see that time and time again in the data. Thinking about policy that sort of looks at, equity. This is something we do in prevention. For example, we have sort of a forthcoming mental health leave policy for students. For many years, we didn't have an institutional-wide policy to really think about. And so part of that is thinking about what are the rules, regulations, procedures, policies in the work that you're doing in your unit. And something else we think about in prevention is like looking at the root causes of problems. We know that programming is popular. We do programming. We're not necessarily saying like don't do programming at all, but we know that this issue is a lot larger than programming. But if you are going to do programming, think about having program that addresses the root causes of the problem. And so some examples of that is that we have sexual assault programming that really is looking at power and privilege on campus as a root cause of the issues on campus. So those are some of the ways in which we think about creating change. And then also sharing the data, sharing what we see with folks to help build a collective around a particular issue. Some other frameworks for change that you can think about. So at University Health Services and Prevention and Healthy Campus Initiatives, we take a sort of a policy systems and environmental change approach to health equity. And that means that we look at relationships, resources, environments, and policies that create conditions for well-being and thriving. And that we really try as much as possible to move beyond individual behavior and sort of looking at the root causes. So again, looking at relationships, but then looking at resources. You know, where is funding, where is money going towards addressing a particular issue? What about your physical or virtual environment? And I always like to think about, you know, which students may be able to walk into your space, walk into your program unit, and not have to change anything about themselves. They may see themselves represented in the staff, in the faculty, in the artwork on the walls, in the literature that is shared. And what students may walk into the space and experience none of that. Right? These are the things that we have to think about. What students may feel like they have to change their language, their dress, everything about them in order to feel like that they fit in. So thinking about your environment, thinking about the resources, and then also policy, written and unwritten policy. So what I mean by policy is, yes, there's some sort of written rules and regulations around how you do things, but policy is also how you talk about things. It's the discourse. So how are you talking about sense of belonging in your unit, in your department, and the work that you're doing? Another thing we can think about is addressing both the symptoms and the disease. So sense of belonging is really, or a lack of sense of belonging, is really a symptom of a larger issue. And so that's a part of what the data is getting at, is that when students don't have it, it's a larger issue with the campus climate. It's not a problem with the students. So if students don't feel like they belong, it's not like, oh, well, there's something wrong with the students. No, there's something wrong with the environment. And so we need to reframe how we're looking at that. So part of the tension that's there is having short-term harm reduction. So what can we do in the meantime to support students who may not have a sense of belonging, and then working towards long-term change? And ultimately, you want to do both. But depending on your unit, depending on your role, you may be focusing on one or the other, and that's okay. You know, a lot of the work that we do in prevention is sort of showing what the symptoms are, showing what the consequences are for students who have a lack of belonging, and then working with other constituents on campus to sort of address those issues in the day-to-day. These other two frameworks are to sort of think about like how to start to work towards change, and thinking about and reflecting on what are your spheres of influences. You know, where is it that you can make change? So maybe you don't work with parents or families, you know, depending on your role, but you maybe work with students being able to create peer relationships with each other, or sort of positive reactions among peers. And so that may be your sphere of influence. And so there are many entry points. And again, the other framework is the points of entry model. And it's simply to start where you can, to start where you are, to reflect on what is my role. How can I help foster a sense of belonging, both for myself? How can I advocate for students who have a lack of sense of belonging? And basically start where your role allows you to start, and then collaborate and work along the way. So these are some of the frameworks that you can maybe think about and chat with folks in your unit, in your department, and know that people can take a different approach. So there's not sort of a one size fits all. We, you know, at prevention sort of look at policy systems and environment, but you may just want to look at your program and think about how to grow it in your program and think about where you particularly can start. Here's some other ways from research from other institutions. Again, we're not the only institution thinking about sense of belonging. It definitely is really in vogue right now to consider how to foster to do that. And these are some ideas that have come from other institutions, that have come from research. And so we understand that you may not be able to do all of these things, right? Depending on your role, depending on your connections with students. But what we do know, and this is something that we're really working for, is that representation matters a whole lot. Students being able to see themselves reflected in the other student population, also with faculty and staff. And so, one area that just sort of keeps coming up in the research is that having students sort of exposed to role models from marginalized backgrounds. So they see people that look like them. And that the representation and diversity of the faculty and staff is equal to that of the students. And then finding ways, again, that you can facilitate positive teacher-student relationships, ways that you can facilitate positive peer relationships, meeting students' basic needs, as I mentioned, sense of belonging, is right in there with meeting students' basic needs. So looking at the information, are students feeling housing insecure, food insecure? If that is a role that you can play, then working to meet students' basic need can be a way of helping to foster sense of belonging. Something that definitely we try to encourage is having students to be a part of this process. I've learned that nothing that you can do in terms of like wanting to help students shouldn't be done without them. As the phrase says, like, nothing about us without us. And so I really think about that with students. So students have to be a part of this process, and they know. So allowing them opportunities, and I really appreciate the work that we do and the work that Rihanna does that allows for students to not only do the quantitative survey part, but to leave space in our surveys for qualitative data, for students to write in their own words what's happening to them. That is equally as important, and also gives us sort of a rich description about how they're experiencing sense of belonging on this campus. Some of the other things here, I won't read all of them, but demonstrating care and compassion, definitely normalizing challenges to belonging. So again, students may say, well, I may not really fit in here. And while that is common, we do know that some students are more likely to experience them in others. And we do know from the research that students who are not engaging in this high risk problematic drinking are less likely to feel like that they belong here on this campus. So while at the same time normalizing it, in some ways everyone may feel it, some students may feel it more than others, right? And so part of it is addressing why that may be, addressing the root cause, and really work in whatever sphere of influence that you have to really decentralize, to really pull away and discourage students from engaging in this high-risk problematic drinking, not just for themselves, but also for the community and the campus climate, because we just see that it's having devastating effects. There's just no way around it. And then disaggregate data. Keep pulling it apart, thinking about different identities and how they play a role. You can do that with surveys. You can do that with talking with students and focus groups. However you're getting this information, really thinking about all the different identities that students may bring and how that may shape their experience here. So now, if we were together in person, we would invite a time for reflection, a time to think about what's your call of action going to be, Where do you think that you can enter into this conversation on belonging? And so here are some of the questions that we would like you to think about, to take some time to ponder, to write about, to share. Thinking back again to the belonging exercise that we did at the beginning. When you said to yourself, I belong here, what came up for you? Did you feel affirmed or not? Where do you see yourself in the sense of belonging narrative at UW? What surprised you? Again, this is rich, rich data. And for me, even though I've seen this presentation several times, there's always something new that grabs my attention, right? So what surprised you about this data, about the information presented in this session? What questions do you have? Again, it's an introduction. This is the beginning, not the end. But there may be things that remaining curiosities that you have around sense of belonging. And then more importantly, where do you see yourself as part of addressing these disparities? What your role might be, and where do you think you can enter into this conversation, enter into this dialogue? Because we need all hands on deck. In order to change a campus climate, it takes everyone. It takes everyone doing the work, advocating, learning. And that's part of why you're here, I'm sure. And so we would love to engage with you all on ideas about how to foster a sense of belonging, how really to decenter and change the high-risk drinking culture on campus, how really to have really zero tolerance around racism and discrimination on our campus. Because it is hurting our most vulnerable. It is hurting our students in ways that will impact them for years and years to come. And then think about, who are you going to share this with? Who in your unit, in your department, do you think this will be interesting? Who do you want to talk to next about sense of belonging and the work that needs to be done on campus? You will have access to this slide deck, and so there's a link to additional resources. It's not exhaustive because there's so much research out there, but it's some good stuff to get you started. Some literature that's there, some great articles that have been written around sense of belonging, some information around what other colleges are doing in terms of if you want to benchmark and see what's going on. And then also we have some great resources here right at UW-Madison in terms of looking at the data. Rihanna mentioned that Healthy Academics Toolkit, which is a great tool to really visualize. If you're a visual person like me, it's really interesting to interact with some of the data and sort of play around and see how different identities and student experiences shape sense of belonging, shape well-being, and shape mental health on this campus. So it's a place for you to start, and then you can grow and see what happens from that point. However you sort of move forward in this process, we ask as a call to action for everyone who is viewing this presentation to at least start tracking sense of belonging in your department, in your unit. How are you looking at sense of belonging? How do you know whether or not students have that? Find ways to get access to data and really think about sense of belonging. Disaggregate the data or talk with folks. I know you may have research folks on your team. If you consult with researchers, have them and really, pull apart this information and look at, okay, if I'm working in a particular major or within a particular college, we do have that information at UHS as well, and seeing like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Students with this type of major may more or less have a sense of belonging. Find your point of entry into the conversation. Maybe it's talking with someone else. Maybe it's looking at your programming and seeing, who's represented and who is not within that programming. And then lastly, be explicit around decentering high-risk drinking culture on campus. Be explicit for advocating that really address issues of discrimination on campus, discrimination and racism, and frankly, anti-Blackness, that so many of our Black students don't feel like that they are represented, that they feel valued. This is an institutional problem. And really that high-risk drinking, microaggressions, discrimination, racism, these are the areas that we need to tackle as a community in order to move forward and to create the type of environment that we want for all of our students to thrive. So with that, we hope that this has been a time of insight for you, a time of reflection, and also a time of feeling compelled to want to continue on with efforts to make UW-Madison an equitable place for all students to have a sense of belonging. Yes, some of the data is not great, but we know it. And, part of the biggest thing is now that we know, what are we going to do? And I know there are folks on campus who are interested in this work, who want to be a part of the collective. And so definitely reach out to us. We have our contact information here. I know there are folks who are interested and who will continue to think about sense of belonging and what it means on this campus. So definitely stay tuned and find your point of entry into this conversation. Thank you so much for this opportunity to engage in this work. And I hope that you all have a great rest of conference and enjoy the rest of the Diversity Forum. Take care.